Hey there. Welcome to Spiritual Unraveling with Ashley and Nate, a podcast about the sometimes messy process of spiritual awakening. We invite you to listen in as we discuss spiritual topics and themes showing up in our personal lives and out in the broader world. We promise to always bring our grounded and lived experiences to the exploration of these topics. We know that the process of awakening can sometimes be lonely and even scary. It is our intention to remind you that you're not going through this alone and that we're all in this together. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the episode. Welcome to Spiritual Unraveling with Ashley and Nate. Hi, everyone. This is Nate jumping on at the beginning of this episode to just let you know we had some recording difficulties and it took us a few tries to get going. So today, this is going to be the intro and hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks.
Okay, going with the flow.
Take 3. Okay, so I'm curious now about the reaction around the grounding. What came out?
We had a little bit of this discussion last night in my Sangha I think that my suspicion is that grounding is hard because we're so conditioned to be in survival mode. And survival mode is a way of being distracted from the present moment, the fullness of the present moment.
Yeah.
And the real kind of both feed into this life. And I think one of my clients articulated it yesterday really well. I said, well, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of if you show up in present time, fully accepting your life exactly as it is right now? She said, I'm afraid of the truckload of trauma that I'm going to have to experience. And then we talked about how it doesn't show up all at once. You know, it kind of shows up exactly at the time that you can handle it for your growth. It's very loving, that truckload. It's about reclamation of self. It's about wholeness. It's about healing and love, really, you know. So I wonder about that. I wonder if it's just this kind of conditioned fear of anything that isn't like pleasant or numbing or distracting has a sense of fear around it. And grounding, you know, I have this like theory now that grounding sort of automatically invites your stuff, that truckload. Because there's a sense of almost like I'm here. Mm-hmm. I'm here, you know, and then your stuff can be like, oh, you're here? Okay, great.
Let's go through some boxes.
Exactly. Like I got a backlog here, you know, so.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's funny about that I think you're alluding to is the system has a built-in check and balance. Like it doesn't want to overwhelm you. It wants attention and it wants you to attenuate and put some energy into yourself, but it won't overload you because, you know, the human system, the human body, all of our human spirit, all of us, it's like we're just like nature, basically. And systems in nature don't usually go that wonky. Balance and homeostasis is kind of like a core principle. And I think trauma work falls along that same line. You know, I mean, I think you could be guided or you could willpower yourself to truckloading your trauma. But I don't think that your system is going to do that to you. I think your brain or your ego would have to kind of like, I'm not a good person unless I process everything in, 1 week or some crazy nonsense like that.
Right. I also feel like I have this in me, and I've heard this a lot over the years with clients too. It's like, or just people, you know, they're waiting to feel ready, like they're ready to process things or take them on. And there's something real about the readiness, but it isn't always what we think. You know, I think readiness comes by bringing your attention into grounding or self-care or self-love. Even though those things don't seem like they have anything to do with trauma, they create readiness. And once you actually have readiness, then you're ready. I think when we're orienting from fear and we're orienting from the conditioning itself, the conditioning doesn't want to open it up because its focus is on safety and protection. Yeah. And so we can't really listen to that part of I guess that's what I'm saying. It's like, what parts are you listening to? And it does seem like there's this struggle around a leap of faith in going into even just real states of meditation, which is just letting go. It's just the surrendered moments, you know, surrendered minutes or whatever, or grounding, or just anything you're doing that's not reinforcing the habits of the mind. It's like we're learning how to listen to different parts of ourselves, or we're learning to create readiness, or we're learning to create sturdiness or capacity, or even just the realization of your soul's path or your purpose or your journey here, whatever. Just being able to reflect on something other than your conditioning creates this container for healing, because healing isn't something we do, since healing is something that we create a container for, and then healing happens on its own.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
mind doesn't really like that either, does it? The mind doesn't.
No, because the mind
I want
wants
to
to
be in
get in.
charge.
Wants to get in on the healing. It's like, no, let me get my hands in there. You're like, no, it's healing is kind of like it's like little kids when they grow. Like you grow when you sleep. You don't grow. You can't like think you're growing and be like, I'm doing a lot of brain power here, so I must be growing. Yeah, and the other thing too, when we ground, we're getting into our body. And even though this is a spiritual show, you and I are both very much steeped in psychology. And I think of like Bessel van der Kolk's work, how the body keeps the score. And so we can be doing this meditation practice in someone like you who's got a foot in both these worlds. You're guiding people into this place, and unbeknownst maybe to the people who are starting to ground themselves is, oh, when I come back into my body, I have access to this lineage of good and bad pain, trauma, also all the bodily sensations that we think about when we have joyful experiences as well. But it really is a way to get you back into your body, and I think that is one of the major access points to starting to work with trauma and with pain and doing recovery kind of stuff. And so it's kind of weird. I could see how someone could do a meditation and not necessarily expect that to happen, and then for it to happen and then be surprised and a little off kilter, maybe just like, whoa, that's not what I thought was going to come up. I thought I was doing a mindfulness practice. I thought it was connecting to Mother Earth. And it's like, yes, you were. And when you came back into yourself and into your body, then it goes back to what you were just saying. Then there's some stuff to
Yeah.
maybe examine or look at or
Yeah.
just acknowledge. I think when we talk about healing, what you were saying too, the acknowledging something's existence is such a huge first step. And there's a lot of the other stuff, it can kind of go on autopilot. You just have to acknowledge that something's happening in you and that you're ready to look at it and work with it. I don't know.
Totally. That to me, and I don't know how you get to that place. I think we all wind our way there in different paths, maybe, but getting to that willingness, that readiness to, for example, if you have an unwanted emotion come up, like shame, there's just this automatic response to resist it, get rid of it. How do you get to a place where you're like, oh, shame is here?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's like, I guess would be step one, is just notice it, because there's so much unconscious conditioning at work all the time in all of us. That's why this is an infinite process.
Yeah.
Because as we open to this more and more and more, we're just inviting more and more of our unconscious selves to become conscious, so that we have more choice. We have more spaciousness, we have more peace, we have more freedom, all the things.
Yeah.
But you can't force that stuff. I mean, but you keep creating a safe container for your unconscious stuff to arise. And then when it does, you're like, oh, here it is. Fear, shame, anger, rage, helplessness, whatever. And then just being with it, just being willing to allow it to be here, just inviting it in even closer, recognizing that this is an aspect of you that needs your attention, that needs maybe an upgrade of information. It needs just to be held. It needs to be seen. But that the process of the transformation of our unconscious conditioning happens in the holding, but it happens on its own. I don't know how to explain how that works. I think the way that I was thinking about it yesterday, because we had a little bit of this discussion last night in my Sangha, was like maybe what you were saying, like just the laws of nature is that things are always changing. They're always evolving. We're always transforming. And so if you really trust that, you can just hold steady with whatever you're experiencing, it will transform. And what I notice is the less I am trying to manage or control or get rid of or whatever, it sends me insights. It wants to be moved. It wants to be understood. And so I do get insight about it. Healing is a big part of spiritual awakening. It has to be.
Yeah. Well, I think what happens when you start a meditation practice, it's kind of weird. It's almost like it's reverse engineering the container. So you start the process, somehow someone says, "Hey, this is good," or we have enough kind of built up in the culture to say our mainstream society is like, everyone's kind of acknowledges that it's slightly toxic enough at a baseline that you should do something mentally to counteract that. And I think that there's enough voices out there now that are pointing to meditation as one of the more robust and accessible tools to be used. And so you kind of get into that and you're thinking, well, it's, I want to help my anxiety, or I just want to de-stress or whatever. But unknowingly, what you're doing is you're creating a container and opening up the space inside yourself to then start this inner work. Because before that, it becomes very difficult to look neutrally at those feelings when they come up. Like shame. Shame is such a powerful emotion that almost at a baseline, it's going to be something that's either rejected or squashed pretty quickly, because most of us have felt that feeling at some point in our life, and it is almost unbearable. So of course it gets kind of shoved under the rug. But when you can move to a place of neutrality with thoughts in general, which is kind of what meditation does, then shame comes up in everyday life or something, or anger, or one of these kind of more unacceptable emotions. And instead of the knee-jerk reaction, you now have a little, it's just kind of like any argument you would have with a person or a negative interaction. Instead of moving right into your trigger or your wound, you have a gap where you then get to say, oh, I'm being triggered. I'm having a reaction. How do I want to deal with this? And that gap in that space is the fundamental power of this kind of like mindfulness work. Is it's like it really gives you access to being able to then work with those energies. Otherwise, they often become kind of an automatic shutdown for a lot of people.
Totally, totally. I love that you brought in the word neutrality. I think that's the key.
Yeah.
I think is exactly the key, that you're maybe in the meditation practice, you start to see that you can stay in a neutral place no matter what your mind is doing. You develop the muscle of neutrality. And I would say it's not that easy to develop, partly because of our culture, partly because of our conditioning. We're just like, that can't be it. That feels like boring or nothing or not productive,
Right.
or something like that. But once you kind of get it and you understand the energy of that neutrality and that spaciousness, that nothingness, that space around everything, then when you're triggered and you can see the trigger from that neutrality, you don't even need to do anything.
Right.
It's the same thing that you're practicing in meditation, which is simply being with whatever's here. But from that place of neutrality, it's like when your kid falls and, they're not that hurt, but there's the stunned and there's the, kind of moment of expression. And, and if you stay neutral, you can just watch the emotions naturally move.
Yeah.
Whether it takes 1 minute or 10 minutes, or sometimes those are opportunities for kids to express for longer and move other emotions that have gotten stuck. That's true for us too. I notice sometimes if a book or a show or a video, kind of evokes an emotion, sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, I'm like, I can feel other stuck experiences riding the wave of that emotion. It's like, but it's the same thing. We can observe our own emotions. We can experience, observe our own triggers and really hold them in neutrality. You will be shocked at how they move on their own and the depth of information that can come through. It's like a miracle. The first time that I really watched it happen, I could witness it. And part of, I think we all have the capacity to witness it. I think I'm fascinated by it. So I'm like tuned into that channel. I'm really interested in it. Partly, it's what I've done my whole life. But the first time I was able to witness it and experience it at the same time, I was just like, this is a miracle. This feels like a miracle. Miracles are the things that happen sort of outside of your control. Like you're just like, I did not make that happen. That just happened. Right. And it happened because I was present and neutral.
Yeah. Well, and I think we're talking about it, but we haven't exactly made it explicit. So, but I want to make it explicit. The reason that emotions and feelings that come up become problematic is when we don't let them do what they need to do, which is wash over you, give you somatic information that then you process and you let go. And so we have been trained, at least it feels like Western culture has gotten us to a place where certain emotions or feelings are unacceptable. Therefore, when the processing when the processing begins, we squash it. And then instead of the emotion moving through you, it gets stuck inside you. And so, I mean, it's kind of implicit in what we're talking about, but I think it should be, we should talk about like that is the main reason why you want to be processing trauma is so that the stuff that got stuck or stuffed down inside you can be pulled up and just released. And it wants to be released. It's basically like a leaf on a stream or a cloud in the sky. What happened is it came into our system, we grabbed hold of it and like stuffed it down below. We're like, just get out of here. What are you doing here? And then it sits inside your body in these weird places, sometimes your stomach, sometimes your heart, sometimes your head, wherever, or other parts of your body. And then it causes sort of all sorts of issues. And also the other flip side to this that I also want to make sure that we're clear on is that we don't do meditation or create neutral containers to examine our feelings so that we don't have feelings like shame come up anymore, because they're going to come up. We're humans. These things are going to happen. The point of this is to make our emotional processing system much more fluid and back, again, we're talking about nature, back into a homeostatic kind of place where it can come in, it can inform you, give you that kind of information it wants to give you, and then you can thank it and release it and let it move out of your body. When you start to do that, you're going to realize that health, anxiety, a whole bunch of stuff starts to fall into place in a much different place. And I'm not saying that I've only experienced this fleetingly, but that process is quite powerful.
Totally. Totally. I love that. I like that you brought in the somatic experiencing because that is such an important part of it. It's like that's the coming home. That's the welcoming it back in. That's the reclamation of self. That's the healing can only happen in the somatic experiencing of it. But you're holding that somatic experiencing from that place of neutrality, meaning that you're not judging it. And this is such an important thing. Last night in our group, when we got to this part of the conversation, somebody said, it's so counterintuitive to move closer to these experiences. It's so counterintuitive. And I thought, I don't think it's counterintuitive. I think it's counter conditioning. It's counter because we learned at such a young age what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And we just hold that in such an unconscious way. And we respond to these unacceptable things with resistance. And so it feels counterintuitive, but actually there's something really natural about expression. One of my friends sent me a video of her 9-month-old just shrieking with she wrote me like, he's a wild animal. I'm like, he is a wild animal. He was like just shrieking with this like guttural noises that just came from nothing. I mean, he just was just, and as he was expressing this just guttural, I don't know if shrieking is even the right word. It was just came this like wild animal call. He heard it, and you can hear, you can watch him on the video, hearing his own wild primal scream, and
Yeah.
he was so delighted by it. And then he just kept doing it. And then he's so delighted by it and he kept doing it. Right. So in her house, in that moment, she didn't shut that down.
Yeah.
So he didn't receive a message, don't do that, which I'm sure, like I have said to my kids many, many times, don't do that, you know,
Yeah.
and shut down whatever and made things unacceptable. And to live in society, some things are unacceptable, you know, and we have to like live together and cooperate and everything. But when we have that deep, deep, deep resistance to patterns in ourselves, I mean, what I think is eventually these patterns show up to the point where now we're suffering. We're suffering because of the patterns. And then we seek out therapy or meditation or somatic experiencing or some other therapeutic, modality. And we're going for it. But this is it. This is like, there is no way out but through.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you
Well, and
said
also in addition to those things, then there's also just the whole plethora of other wildly acceptable social norms around drinking, medicating with pharmaceuticals, self-medicating off-label with pharmaceuticals, all those things, no judgment, just saying those are all things that are part of that tamping down mechanism or the numbing or the shutting down the feedback loop that the body is trying to give you, saying, hey, we've held on to the shame a long time and it's getting a little crowded back here. And when you were saying that about your friend's young child, it makes me think, a lot of my experiences with animals. And I think about both prey animals, like flight animals, like sheep and horses and different things like that. And then even predators too, like cats and dogs. And they all have a somatic reset that happens after an activating event. And as humans, we don't really, we're a little disconnected from that. And maybe it's because we're so cerebral, but it's like if you see like two dogs get in a fight and then they like get pulled away, they like walk around and they kind of like, they just like shake their body and they like might eat some grass and they might pee on something. And cats do that kind of big stretch shake. Horses and farm animals, like they do a lot of like lipping and drinking water, all these different things. You just notice it. And it may be for us, and what your friend's little guy was doing is like, there needs to be some somatic release, just a connection, a reminder that we're embodied. And it's the point of focus for where a lot of this stuff lives. And that part is, I think, very confusing for people because so much of science and technology and civilization over the last like 100, 200 years has been around the brain, just like fascination with the brain and mentalism. And there's something to that. But in a lot of ways, this is a much, much more fundamental, foundational thing. It's like, no, something bad happens. And, it's why people often in like war zones end up having sex and doing lots of somatic things to let loose. Like, we almost died. Let's do something to like feel alive. Let's do something to connect. And I think there's probably a place for some titrated level of embodiment around a trauma or a trigger or whatever. I mean, I think meditation is a great tool for that, but I also think of it as a tool, and there probably is like, maybe a good primal scream for some people is just like, let's just bypass all of that and go right to get it out.
it's probably exactly what we need to do. And we have let go. We've moved so far from the rituals that probably when we were closer to our bodies and the earth and nature and animals, that we probably had lots of rituals for that we don't have anymore. And people are kind of pulling them back in.
Yeah.
It made me think that, part of the beautiful, I mean, we started this conversation really talking about grounding, really, and being in the body and being awake in the body, finding that neutrality, that way of really listening, I think, in the body. Like, I think that the body and your intuition and your soul starts to direct you to what you need. So if you get a call to do something that you normally wouldn't do, or go somewhere that you normally wouldn't go, or there's different ways that we get directed to like healing and situations and experiences and expressions that will give us these opportunities. And I think instead of listening deeply to our own unique call of our own intuition, our own bodies, we often go to what should I do? What are all the things that I should be doing? I should be meditating every day. I should be going to yoga. I should be fasting. I should be, on this keto diet or that, whatever, vegan. I mean, it's so we get so in our minds about, and there's nothing wrong with any of those things. Those are beautiful, supportive things. But what does your soul need right now? What does your body need right now? And it's always going to change. It's always evolving. It's always moving. It's never fixed, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like if you use exercise as a tool to do your reset, that's great. But if that's your only tool, that's limited. What happens when you get injured? What happens if you need a recovery day? There's all these different things. And I think this is why, as a meta tool, meditation is important, because what it does is it makes you more aware of some of those subtle signals and energies. And I don't think you probably need to always be in meditation or doing that practice, but the beneficial aspect of it for people, at least initially kind of trying to recalibrate themselves, is that you will move into a place where those subtle signals, they have a voice. They don't really have a voice if you have been kind of plugged into the system. And then maybe you can start using your own subtle signals. And like you said, figure out day to day, what do I need? Maybe today it isn't this, it's going on a hike, and maybe it's a cold, all these other things. But you have to be able to hear and access that guidance. And that guidance, unfortunately, is just not nearly as loud as life or culture or social media or your brain or your ego. It's a subtle thing, and it requires that bit of quietude and neutrality and checking in, an acknowledgement that there is information coming through. And it's a kind of incumbent upon me, if I want to utilize that signal, to kind of foster an environment or situation in which I'm going to be able to have access to it. And I don't think it's that complicated, but there's an intentional piece around it.
I was actually thinking that this is, I think, really complicated for most people, because leaving the conditioned mind is like leaving the safety, the illusion of safety.
Yeah.
And just listening to your intuition. I mean, that sounds like a crazy person.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, think about how not it like 100 years ago, how we were all trapped in these boxes, even more so than we are today. So we're freeing ourselves, but there's still so much fear around really, really being a sovereign being, meaning, a fully sovereign being means I am just I don't even know how to say it, because this stuff gets really tricky to talk about, but I am following my own heart in everything that I do,
Yeah.
and I'm really trusting my own intuition, my own path that's unfolding. And even if it takes me to scary places, or it takes me to new places, or I can trust that it would never take me there to hurt me. It would never take me. Like, you start to just develop this deep trust in yourself where you can really honor that. And life just becomes infinitely more exciting, more alive, and calmer, because there's not the clutter of there's not the clutter of the shoulds. In fact, quiet and space and peace is sort of required to hear the next right thing.
Yes.
To be able to really hear and really listen. So you kind of get the meditative state becomes more normal, like your normal baseline state, because there's a feedback loop. There's such a positive feedback loop with being able to listen to that intuition becomes so much more compelling than anything else. So you want to be able to hear it. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess to clarify my statement, I don't think it's the fear is the fear and the overriding that kind of cultural conditioning is the difficult part, but the
Right.
process itself is not difficult. But
No,
there
it's
is
shockingly simple. And I think
yes,
that's what people
yes.
are like, it can't be that.
Yeah. Which I
Yeah.
think it also confounds our kind of monkey brains too,
Yeah.
because
Totally.
there we because then there's that whole subset of us, and I'll put myself in there a lot of times in the self-help camp, which is just like, let's make this harder or more complicated than it needs to be.
Totally. Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of that, it makes sense because we're collective species and the culture at large right now, the kind of game is exclusion. And so if you don't fit in, if you don't look a certain way, if you don't act a certain way, there's this underlying threat of ostracizing. And sometimes it's not even underlying, sometimes it's overt. And so that's the belief that underpins all of this. And if you start to acknowledge that that belief is controlling vast aspects of your life and you just start to question it a little bit, it just loosens things up. You're not going to get rid of it all at once, but it sure as heck can make some like limiting kind of situations, it can just make them feel kind of silly where you're like, well, why am I doing that? I think of just like the idea that how many of us are comfortable with the idea of saying something like, well, what would they say? Or, the idea of a collective they living inside your brain, that is so insane.
Yeah.
Like there's some jury or collective of judgmental jerks constantly looking at you, and that is just, it's wild how much that has a detrimental effect on your life and how much of that is working like kind of 24/7, or at least when you're awake, to just control you or limit your options.
Totally. It's like these little prisons that we live in. And we don't always know. I think it's just wild how we could be living in these little prisons and not even know we're in prison
Yeah.
because you're just so used to living with those limitations. But man, when you realize you're in prison, you want to get out. That's the beautiful process of seeing through our own ways that we imprison ourselves, our own psychic judgments and ways we limit. And I say it, prison sounds really like negative, like I'm saying it's negative. And it does create suffering, these things. But prison is also safe.
Yes.
You don't know what's outside. You don't have to explore what's outside of the prison. You don't have to navigate the unknown. You can stay nice in your suffering, in your prison of suffering, but at least it's known, it's familiar. And so I think when we get to that place where we're finally ready to move out of our comfort zones of suffering and open that door, we have the key.
Right.
It's like takes a lot of work. There's like you have to get to a point where you feel you can see the prison walls enough, you can see the door, you can see the key, you can, and then you can make the conscious decision to leave what you've known, leave that familiar place
Yeah.
of limitation and explore into the unknown. And, you're risking everything you said. You're risking being rejected. You're risking making people uncomfortable. You're risking relationships ending.
Yeah.
You're risking change. You're risking, our deepest fears are maybe like rejection and
Yeah.
death or annihilation or something. I don't know what we think is going to happen.
Yeah, social rejection somehow it triggers like a limbic response, because the reality testing on that in this day and age is that it's very easy to find a new tribe of people who hold your belief systems, like now more than ever, especially with the internet. You could think when you were actually in a tribe, getting ostracized was a big deal. But this is part of our evolution as a species. We are no longer like that. And we have access to all these other people who can support us and who can reinforce this way that we're trying to like get out of a certain type of thinking. But it does require a leap of faith and a little bit of bravery. And I think your prison analogy is spot on, because we know this from psychology and from sociology that total institutions like prison, like the military, like certain kind of really intense boarding schools, they create conformity and they indoctrinate you, and you can offload so much mental baggage into that institution or system, but you give up a lot of freedom. And you can see it with actual people who get released from prison, where it's like life on the outside might not be all that they thought it was, or that, it's going to require a huge paradigm shift for them. And I think that the same way, what we're talking about is that's part of the fright, is the paradigm shift. It's like it's going to requires a level of engagement and accountability to check in with yourself as much as possible. But then you can mix in that playfulness that we've talked about, the curiosity, the neutrality, and neutrality first, and then even curiosity about like, ooh, why are these things showing up? And then you're renegotiating your relationship with the new you, which is a really powerful place to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you just brought in like lighten up. All of a sudden I was like, yeah, it's actually could be pretty simple to
Yeah.
like explore the unknown if you bring that lighthearted curiosity in. Because what I was thinking right before you said that was, gosh, it requires this leap of faith. But it was kind of lingering in my mind, like leap of faith, like there was a heaviness to it. And it could be that. It could be that. It could feel that way. And maybe taking that leap of faith, if it feels heavy, requires like courage. And so it's bringing something online, some kind of strength or courage or belief that feels maybe a little heavier, but like that's also cool. Like if you can get in touch with that. But the lightheartedness is also, I mean, if that's accessible, that is the key, because things can move quicker and we can see through things a lot easier when we bring that lighthearted curiosity in, I think. It's just not always available. It's just not always available.
Well, it's the frame, right? It's the perspective. How are you choosing to look at it? I mean, when you were saying that, the leap of faith, I thought of this summer we went up to Lake George, and we were on the lake, and we had the kids with us, and the person who was driving us around was like, "Oh, there's some cliffs that people like to jump off." And I was like, "Take me, please. I love I love all that stuff." So I'm super excited. And then my daughter, who's 12, and our best friend's daughter, who's 12, they both were like, can we go with you? And I was like, yeah, yeah, let's do it. So we like swim off the boat, and we climb onto this island, and we're getting up to the cliffs. And of course, then like immediately it gets very clinchy. They look down, they're like, oh, I don't know if I want to do that. And to stick with this leap of faith analogy, in that moment, I was like, well, why don't we go down to a lower level of the cliff? Okay. You don't have to jump off the 12-foot cliff. You can go down to an 8-foot. And then if that doesn't work, there's actually a 4-foot little rock just above the water. And so, we kind of, that idea of bringing the playfulness to us, because the flip side of like jumping off of something and kind of, oh, I don't know what's going to happen, is like, well, I don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be exhilarating and fun. And then you're at the 12-foot cliff, you're getting good at jumping off cliffs, and you're like, I'm gonna start doing flips, I'm gonna start doing these things, and let's get a rope swing up here. That's how playful you can get when you start to kind of look at these things a little bit differently.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's like probably, I haven't thought about this before, but there's probably a dance with that. Like you do have to take some big leaps of faith. I think there are these choice points that do require courage, but then eventually you realize, oh gosh, that wasn't that bad. Maybe I felt this emotion and I cried and I experienced that kind of old fear or old shame, but I got through it, and there was some part of me that accepted it.
Yeah.
And now I feel lighter, and now I feel open, and now I feel curious. Like, well, what is that? Or what happened there? And maybe the next time a heavy emotion comes in, you're just a little bit more trusting. You're a little bit lighter. It's a little easier to sort of allow and not resist. And maybe you get a little, maybe you resist first, and then you notice, oh gosh, I was resisting. Let me see what I can do. It's like anything. So there's like the open-hearted playfulness, curiosity piece can come in through the lived experience.
Yeah.
Lived experience that nothing bad happens. That's what I always realize in anything that I'm afraid of, anything that risk that I'm taking. It's like, well, nothing bad happened. Even if something bad did happen, it's like, well, that there was so much in that for me,
Yeah.
But yeah, I like that relationship between the leap of faith and like the more playful, open-hearted curiosity piece.
Yeah. And then I think it's also just important to recognize in ourselves the areas and aspects of our life, the ability and the bandwidth for doing leaps of faith are going to be different. So don't look at this process as a kind of a monolith. It's varied. If you're someone who experiences great quality relationships, then your bandwidth and your ability to take risks and to really put your needs out there as it comes to relational things is going to be much, much bigger than, say, if your biggest area of constriction is around like finances or around independence with like jobs or something. That's like, well, then that place, maybe the risk is really just looking at the scary thing and sitting with it. It's like
Yeah.
you're not trying to jump off this thing, you're just looking
Right.
at it.
Right.
So to have, like, I guess what I'm bringing in is the nuance and the gentleness and the grace that we're this amorphous work in progress in certain parts of our lives. And we know just through self inventory and self reflection, and even just looking at your life, some parts of our life are much more successful and robust than others. Other areas are like where we have our biggest growth. And those are the areas I just think where we want to call in the grace, call in the gentleness. This is the baby step zone, right?
Totally. Totally. I love how you always bring that in, Nate. I really, really do. I think, there's a way that I know for me, I mean, I know I have really high expectations for myself. I can get really like, and I like that. I like, there's an element that I really like about myself because I do have like courage and I do persist and I have determination and I have a good work ethic. I can work hard. But man, without that gentle piece, without giving yourself room for grace and understanding and just taking some of that pressure off, I like you always bring in those reminders for people as they're going through this, because it is often what shows up for people is this just insane judgment. And I feel like I've said this on this podcast so many times, but if you just did a practice of looking at your own judgment, you would just be so surprised at how ingrained it is in your own psyche and how it's keeping you from your own freedom.
Yeah.
Because the truth of who you are has no limitations. That primal scream from that baby is exactly what that baby needed. His true essence did not judge that. He doesn't know he doesn't know yet to judge that, but if he did it in the middle of Target, she'd probably be like, maybe not. Right. And then he'd be like, oh, that's bad. So we're kind of coming back home to a place of deep, deep self-acceptance and self-love. And I think it's, if we don't become aware of our own prisons, of our own judgment, of our own limitations, we can't ever get out. It will always be like, oh, that's for somebody else. Freedom is for somebody else. Peace is for somebody else. Like abundance is for somebody else, true love is for somebody else. I mean, whatever our theme is, whatever we're looking for. So,
well, thank you for saying that. I bring it in because my inner critic always needs to be reminded of that. I definitely agree. I feel like judgment has been probably like the biggest theme or thing that I have been working with for it feels like 18 months minimum, maybe 2 years, where it's just like you said, when it came up in a way where I actually saw it and started to kind of work with it, I was, holy cow, this thing is everywhere. And how it is a fundamental spoke or aspect of tons and tons of limiting beliefs. That judgment piece, it's kind of like the tip of the spear. It's the thing that pierces you, right? And the counter to that, the important bigger part of that is getting macro or in far and far and far back and just be like, there isn't judgment. That does not exist. It's a human construction. It it serves a purpose. We do live in a society. There are rules. We want people to stop at stoplights. There's things that are important that come from that whole kind of mental system. But on a very big macro universe, galaxy, whatever soul level, it's just a whole lot of all that is. And there's no judgment. It's just experiences. It's just growth. It's experience. It's different things banging into other things. And although that's like kind of a weird, big thought, I just like to think about it as a way to just take the steam a little bit out of judgment. Judgment's really up. Just get really big and think about yourself as a self-aware monkey on a rock in the middle of the galaxy. Like, okay, let's have a little perspective here. Look up at the stars and be like, all right, this is probably a silly thing to get all worked up about.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that so much of all the psychological work that I did was so important, so critical. But without this larger picture that you just described so beautifully, I don't know that I could have really freed myself. I think I would just create nicer and nicer prisons.
Yeah.
More pleasant prisons. But the idea of really being free, I could only ever have begun to unlock the prison doors and really go out into the mystery, into the unknown, with only my truth, my intuition, only my own heart, with this bigger perspective of acceptance, deep, deep acceptance and isness, and then there's just this perpetual, that's where the healing comes in, because from that point of view, I can then see the places that I'm still imprisoned, which will just be probably for the rest of my life. I just, which is actually kind of fun to me. I think it's fascinating. I mean, this is the body that I'm living in. This is the identity that I was born into. This is the one life that I have in this consciousness to work with. So healing becomes the name of the game. It's like exciting.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the key. If you can work everything around to get to that excited or curious or even neutral, as we talked about earlier, any of those kind of perspectives when it comes to this kind of work, then you're in such a good place. It just opens things up. Hey everyone, we hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions or feedback for us, please send us an email at spiritualunraveling@gmail.com. If you'd like to learn more about what we're both up to, you can follow Ashley at www.mountainmeditationgroup.com. And you can find more about what I'm doing at spiritual-stewardship.com. We hope you have a great day.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.